We're very fortunate today to have Anja Manuel join us. Former diplomat, author, advisor on emerging markets, Anja Manuel is co-founder and principal, along with former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, former National Security Advisor Stephen Hadley, and former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, who we've had speak at a Farm Credit Council meeting before. In Rice, Hadley, Gates, and Manuel LLC, a strategic consulting firm that helps U.S. companies navigate international markets. She is the author of The Brave New World, India, China, and the United States. And from 2005 to 2007, she served as an official at the U.S. Department of State, responsible for South Asia policy. Earlier in her career, Ms. Manuel was an attorney at WilmerHale, working on corporate governance, international and Supreme Court cases, and represented special committees of major corporate boards before the U.S. Congress, Department of Justice, and the SEC. She was also an investment banker at Solomon Brothers in London. A graduate of Harvard Law School and Stanford University, Ms. Manuel now also lectures and is a research affiliate at Stanford. She's a frequent commentator on foreign policy and technology policy for TV and radio, and writes for publications ranging from the New York Times to the Financial Times, Fortune, The Atlantic, Newsweek, and others. A note to the audience. Ms. Manuel has agreed to field questions following her remarks. To ask a question, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. A dialog box will open and you can type in your question. Following the presentation, I'll read the questions aloud for answers. So please take the time as you go. You can enter those Q&A anytime you want. Just enter them in that box and we'll get an answer for you. Thanks very much, Anja, for joining us today. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Jimmy. I'm so happy to be here. As you both said, I really wish it could be in person. That's always so much more fun than over Zoom. We're meeting here at an unprecedented time. There's been a recent transition to President Biden, a public health crisis unlike any of us have ever seen before, an economic downturn, and of course, social and political instability. These are daunting challenges. And while, of course, you are based in the United States, many of your customers, the agricultural businesses and communities you serve, are very impacted by the global economy. So the FCC asked me to come this morning and give you a quick virtual tour of the world. First, how quickly different world economies where your customers export are likely to recover from COVID, and then zooming in on the United States. What are the prospects for a new stimulus package? How is the economy likely to perform as we come out of this slump with the vaccines and move back into a more normal economic cycle? And what is trade going to look like under the new Biden administration? So as Todd and Jimmy have already said, boy, it's been a tough year. It's been a gloomy year, but there's absolutely light at the end of the tunnel. And I just want to say how personally grateful I am to the FCC for all the work. My uncle is a small scale rancher up in Oregon. He works through Farm Credit. He received a PPP loan through all of you. So all the hard work you have done over the past year has really paid off. And I know your customers are incredibly grateful. So it's been a wild year, but let me start with a note of optimism. More Americans voted in the November election than any other time, even in the midst of a pandemic. It's been a roller coaster, but we had a real peaceful transition, and the Biden team are getting their feet under them and moving forward. The world economy will be roiled for probably another 5 to 6 months by COVID, but there's so much positive news on the vaccines front, from Pfizer to Moderna to now Johnson & Johnson vaccines. This is just going to accelerate and ultimately carry us out of this slump. I'd like you to imagine, as we're going through this, 2 split screens. On the one hand is the world economy, where some regions will emerge from COVID very quickly and accelerate economic growth. That's mostly Asia. And some will probably continue to be sluggish through 2021. And that's mostly Latin America. Then the second split screen is within each country. And here I'll just focus on the US. But you've probably heard Larry Summers and other economists talk about a K-shaped recovery, where those at the top of the ladder, people in tech and finance and others, are doing pretty fine. But those already struggling, especially those in the service sector, such as restaurants, hospitality, will take much longer. And that's a harder problem for the new Biden administration to solve. So let's do a tour of the world. I'm going to start for you mentally in China. Generally, those countries that implemented early, aggressive steps to tackle the virus are emerging stronger. Asia is a real bright spot here. So if you remember back to, of course, the virus came from China. First, the Chinese hid information about what was happening, and then they went immediately into an extreme lockdown. This is unlike anything we ever saw in the US or Europe. Literally, people were not allowed to leave their house for a month, except to go get groceries. There are photos that I'm sure you've seen of people covered in trash bags because no one knew yet about masks and things. Intersections in Wuhan, where there normally would be thousands of cars every minute, were empty. It was just a complete lockdown. In China, that's relatively easier to do, of course, because it's an authoritarian regime. China, of course, has to keep growing because it doesn't have a democracy. It's an authoritarian regime. So to keep the Communist Party of China legitimate, economic growth and increasing prosperity for its people is important. China before the pandemic was growing at about 6% a year, although it was going down a little bit as China's population aged. In 2020, they still managed to grow, one of the few economies to do so. And they believe that this year they're going to come roaring back, growing at 9.2% a year. Very, very high. Let's talk about the lockdowns. We've already talked about China. It was the first to shut down really hard. Same with Singapore, Taiwan, Korea. All of these countries, of course, had the experience of SARS. And so they knew how to do this and tackle the virus very quickly. As we all know, in April and May, we were all stuck indoors. Schools closed all over the world, workplaces, restaurants. It's really unprecedented. By early August, however, many restrictions had been lifted or were lighter. People were coming out of their houses. Europe was fairly normal. In the US, we were out and about a little bit more. And of course, as the experts predicted, we are now in the middle of the second, or depending on who you ask, the third wave, which is more dramatic than everything we've seen before. So what have all these lockdowns done to world economies? If you look at a chart that I was going to show you, but we were having a little trouble with the slides in advance. If you look at a chart of world economic growth this year, it's all red. Literally, the whole world is in the red, except for two large countries, China and India, which managed to grow very slightly in spite of this. US GDP was down almost 5%. It's a little hard to measure, but we're expected to come back out and grow at 4.7% this year in 2021. The big if there is if we can get the vaccines distributed as quickly as possible, which is why that's the front of your news screens every single day. We in the United States are slightly outperforming other big economies like Canada, Europe, etc. The big problem region in all this is Latin America. And I mention Latin America only because, of course, it's a big export market for some of your farmers, for some of your customers, especially US meat exports go a lot to Colombia, Peru, Chile. It's a growing market for them. You know, the Latin American countries were slow at reacting to COVID. No part of the world has been as devastated by COVID as Latin America. It's home to 6 of the 10 countries with the highest COVID-19 death rates. Now that sad statistic, of course, changes minute to minute as countries go in and out of lockdown. The IMF believes that the region's GDP will shrink by over 9% last year. And this year, they're only slowly coming out of it. And why is that the case? These countries have fairly weak health systems. severe inequality, and in some countries, especially in Brazil and initially in Mexico, there was real government indifference, sort of wishing it to go away. Asia, as we've talked about, is roaring. When you look at some of the projected growth rates coming out of there, they think the Philippines will grow at 7%, Indonesia at 6%, China, as I said, 9%. And this is good news for your customers and your sector, because of course, China is our biggest export market for soybeans. I'll talk about the trade issues in a minute. Japan and Korea is the biggest export market for US beef. US dairy exports are growing in Southeast Asia. So the fact that Asia is going to grow relatively quickly is positive general news for the agriculture industry overall. Now, let me come back to the US economy, where of course most of us are based and focused on. When are we going to get back to normal? How is the economy going to perform under a new Biden administration? And what prospects are there for the third stimulus package that's now being debated? And most importantly, what's Biden going to do with all of these trade agreements and trade wars, frankly, that he's inheriting from President Trump? I talked a little bit earlier about the K-shaped recovery. White collar workers in some industries are doing well. Those at the top of the ladder generally are doing fine. Those already struggling may take a decade or more to catch up, depending on which economist you ask. And you see this in the unemployment statistics, which cover, when you say overall unemployment in the United States, it's hovering around 7% right now. But that hides a lot of more detailed ground truth underneath. The real unemployment numbers are probably closer to 9% because so many people have been forced out of the workforce and stopped looking. Who are these people who aren't showing up in the numbers? Gig economy workers, Uber and Lyft drivers, they're not on the unemployment rolls because they're still driving, but boy, the demand has gone down by 50%. So they're not making nearly as much money as they were. Many people, especially women, are no longer looking for jobs because schools are out of session and someone has to stay home and take care of all your kids on Zoom school. Many elderly folks have chosen to retire early on limited savings. So those are the people that we really need to support in this next round of stimulus. Let me talk a little bit about why it's been so K-shaped. Why do we have this uneven recovery in the United States? Well, the first really big stimulus that happened last spring when COVID really hit us was monetary. The Fed pumped out dollars. Somebody told me yesterday that 25% of all dollars in circulation were added to the money supply last year. That's unbelievable. So there was a huge support for corporate debt. That's a positive thing, but also that meant a lot of zombie companies that maybe should be going out of business in the United States are being propped up by inexpensive debt prices. As you can see by the craziness that we've seen in the stock market in this past year, it just keeps going up and up, not to mention the craziness we've had with GameStop and AMC in the past week. But you know, the hedge funds are doing well, the private equity firms are doing well, asset prices are roaring. But that's a little different from the real economy that you all work in and live in. And while of course there's been a lot of fiscal stimulus, the PPP program that Todd and others talked about earlier, it's harder to do, first of all. It's harder to get it efficiently to the right people. I live here in California. Our unemployment rolls are famously inefficient. They're about 9 months behind paying people their claims. All of that takes a toll on real people. So having depressed you now early in the morning, we're going to talk about the silver lining in all this. And it's real and it's coming. Of course, back to normal, as you all know, depends on what happens with COVID. The US government has purchased 600 million doses of COVID vaccines. That's great. And I think you have to give credit to Operation Warp Speed for moving this along so quickly, getting vaccines done in record time. And the very intelligent thing they did is they placed a bet on a basket of vaccines. So 2 of each type of different vaccine technology, and that's paying off. You know, the mRNA vaccines that were Pfizer and Moderna, we got very lucky that those work. Now you've got 2 different technologies that are also coming through, that's Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca. So we have a basket of things that we can rely on. Other countries weren't so lucky. Most of Europe has bought enough vaccines to cover their populations. They didn't always bet on the right vaccine horse, if you will. And when you look at countries like India, they probably have enough vaccines to cover 10% of their people. Africa, same thing. So that's where international organizations like Gavi and COVAX, those big alliances, are going to have to step in. Depending on who you ask, you get an optimistic prognosis about when we get enough people vaccinated to go back to normal. Dr. Fauci says most Americans will be vaccinated by fall 2021. The main scientist for Pfizer was slightly less optimistic. He said, really, we won't be back to normal, completely normal, until December of this year. The Biden economic team is coming in. They've been in for, a little less than 2 weeks. And let me say a few words about the team that President Biden is bringing in with him. With few exceptions, they're all veterans of the Obama administration, including, of course, Janet Yellen, very well-respected economist, Wally Adeyemo, who's number 2 at Treasury, Neera Tanden, Catherine Tai, who's the new U.S. Trade Representative. Todd Vilsack was already mentioned. He was going to be here, of course, but is in his confirmation hearing, which I hope is going well as we speak. These are all really, really experienced people who understand the institutions that they're going to be leading. So that's great, because anytime I've been in the US government, it's hard in the very beginning to get your feet under you, to get moving, to see where the levers of power are, to start moving things. So having an experienced team is very important. As you've seen in the news, of course, there's an enormous emphasis on passing this $1.9 billion new stimulus bill as quickly as possible. We can talk about it more in the Q&A session. There's a little bit for everyone in there, including to get the vaccines distributed as quickly as possible, more PPP loans. Some Republicans, of course, have argued for a smaller bill. It is frightening how quickly we're expanding the federal debt, but most economists I talk to think it's better to go bigger now rather than have a sluggish recovery like the one we had after 2008, 2009. And of course, the administration is focused on supporting agriculture through many of the programs that were already mentioned by Todd and by Jimmy, and also through expanding SNAP benefits, food stamps, where the US government directly buys food products from American agribusiness. Finally, let me say a word about trade under Biden. I mentioned Catherine Tai, who's the new US Trade Representative. She's calm, she's very well respected, but she's not part of Biden's inner circle. She hasn't sort of worked for him for years and years, like many of the folks on the foreign policy side certainly have. And here's what she and the team inherits. On China, as you know, the Trump administration struck a phase 1 trade deal early last year. But in spite of it, was a very small deal. It was basically designed to undo a lot of the tariffs that had been put in place in the previous years. Still, hundreds of billions of dollars on US tariffs on Chinese imports remain. And of course, on the other side, the Chinese retaliated, as you know, because it really affected your industry more than others. There were high aspirations in the phase 1 trade deal for the agricultural industry, with agreements struck to guarantee purchases, some sanitary measures, some opening up of the Chinese market. Beijing mostly, I would say, kept its promises under that deal. US chicken farmers gained access to China's poultry market. Now they're the second largest supplier. Beef exports have improved a lot to China. Beijing opened its markets to suppliers of blueberries, potatoes, infant formula, pet food. So it's moving, but of course not as fast as we all would have hoped. There was a commitment under the phase 1 trade deal to buy something like 36 billion in US agricultural products last year. China managed 23.5 billion, so about 2/3 of what they promised. Now that's better than in energy, where they only managed about 1/3 of what they promised to purchase. So that's China. And I think there you'll see the Biden administration take a slow, deliberate approach. Whenever anyone asks them about this, they say, we're reviewing it. We're reviewing all of the Trump executive orders. We're reviewing the trade deals. I was on a Zoom last night with a Chinese foreign minister. You know, the line was very tough that's coming from China. So I think none of us should expect that things will snap back to normal between the US and China like they were in 2015, 2016. I think both sides have really hardened their views of each other. So you can expect some of those agricultural tariffs to come off because, of course, they're hurting the US heartland. But the idea that you're going to have a comprehensive trade deal with China anytime soon, I think, is unfortunately fanciful. Europe. The Europeans, apparently in every call that they've had with President Biden, ask about trade. He doesn't say very much. He's non-committal because, of course, he ran on a platform that was very pro-labor, very pro-environment. They're going to go for fair trade deals rather than rapid trade deals. And so some of these, the Europeans were expecting a quick rollback of a lot of the tariffs. That may be a little bit slower than they're hoping for. And finally, I'll end on an optimistic note, and that, of course, is the US-Mexico-Canada, USMCA trade deal, the former NAFTA. It has been a boon to American farmers, and I think it really worked to address several issues in the market, especially around dairy, wheat, agricultural standards. As you all know well, under NAFTA, the previous trade agreement, there were 0 tariffs on agricultural products, essentially, and they remain at 0. There are new market access opportunities for US exports to Canada of dairy, for example, something that had been a sticking point for a really long time, poultry and eggs. In exchange, the US lets Canadian dairy, peanuts, and other things in. And it prevented some of these supply chain interruptions, especially for meat producers, because they're, of course, those supply chains go across all 3 borders. So that's a positive thing. The takeaway from all this, 2020 and 2021 is going to go down in history as a very wild year. World markets are going to continue to be roiled by COVID, I would say, for another 6 months, and then we'll slowly start coming out of this. But this is the United States. We've come back from worse. We came out of the Great Depression stronger. We came out of the 1960s civil rights upheaval that led to positive changes. And we've always, after periods of such divisiveness and difficulty, found ways to come back together stronger as a country. And I hope we manage to do so here as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anja. I really appreciated your remarks. We've got a bunch of questions that have sort of piled up here on us. Let me ask you a few of them. One of the questions was, with all of the Fed action, there's a lot of worry about at some point we find inflation again. Nobody's seen it for a long time, right? But is that something that's on your radar screen? Do you see as the economy hopefully starts to pick up again, the hangover of some of the Fed actions, especially leading to some inflation?
Yeah, so I'm no economist. I'm a political scientist and a recovering lawyer. But, I have the same worry that I'm sure some in the audience have. We were all taught in basic macroeconomics that if you do massive monetary stimulus, eventually you'll have inflation. So far, we haven't seen it. Seems that most economists I talk to, both on the left and on the right of the political spectrum, say they're more worried about a Japan-type scenario of stagflation and low economic growth. So they're willing to just pump it all in. But yes, as a traditionalist, I've been taught to worry about inflation and also enormous budget deficits. So maybe some reason will prevail again, but right now, the fashion is not that. The fashion is massive stimulus, both on the monetary and, at least from the Democrats, also on the fiscal side.
Thank you. Let me ask you to put your old hat on at the State Department for a minute. And you know, the Biden team, if you think about the international challenges, they're daunting. China, Russia, Iran, on and on. But especially with regard to China, are there, if you were sitting in your old seat and you had to give the Biden team some advice on how to deal with China, what should they be doing?
Yeah, you know, I think they're doing it. A lot of these people going in are old friends. We all know each other well. There is not much difference these days between Republicans and Democrats on their views towards China. Xi Jinping has changed the dynamic. So has President Trump, but President Xi really came out and said, this is China's time. We're going to grow, we're going to be more assertive, and no one is going to keep us down. That's fine. And I think we should support China's rise, because actually that does help all of us. It helps our economy, it helps their economy. But you know, in a lot of ways, they're not playing fair. There's not a fair, hasn't been a fair playing field for American businesses. And on the military side, China is becoming more and more aggressive. You probably heard that they had this big incursion over the border in the high Himalayas they have with India. Dozens of soldiers died, even though they're not allowed to have weapons up on that border. They've been really aggressive in the South China Sea. Just in the past 2 weeks, since the Biden administration took office, that's attempting a reset, the Chinese have been really aggressive, sending their planes over into Taiwanese airspace and kind of threatening things on that border. So it's important to hold out an open hand to China, but if it's gonna be slapped down, we're gonna be tough as well. And so I think you're gonna see an attempt to cooperate on some things. Everyone talks about climate change. I'll get back to that in a second. So it's important to attempt to cooperate, but on most things, I think we're going to be more competitive than cooperative. That doesn't mean we need to be enemies. You can definitely manage your differences and say, hey, all right, we're going to compete in this big global system without making them enemies. Let me say one thing about climate change, because of course there's a huge focus on it.
That was going to be my next question.
Oh, good. Well, we'll go to that in a second. But just with respect to China, that's the one thing that people always say, oh, well, now we're going to cooperate on climate change. Great. The 2014 deal struck by the Obama administration to bring China and then also India into the Paris Accord, I thought was fantastic. But very quickly, you're going to have America say, great, China, now what? What more can you do? Because what they agreed to do under the Paris Agreement is actually fairly modest. So I think we're going to be pushing for more.
You know, one of the priorities clearly coming out of the Biden administration, you know, certainly COVID and attacking that, top priority, but right behind that's climate change.
It is.
What do you expect that, as you say, you're not an economist, you're a political scientist, I guess, what do you expect that to cause in the country? You know, that's a fairly divisive issue. There's a lot of opinions in different places. And what do you think the Biden team's strategy is to move forward on climate change solutions in a way that doesn't make them vulnerable politically?
Right. So my personal view, not speaking for the Biden administration, is that this doesn't have to be as politically divisive as it is. There are ways to grow our economy while also doing the long-term right thing for the environment and for the climate. And I thought it was wonderful when I was watching the videos as we were waiting to go on. You were focused on so many farmers that are already doing the sustainable thing. I think there was someone in Florida. You know, it's possible to have huge agricultural yields, feed ourselves safely, while also taking care of the planet for future generations. And so what you're seeing from the Biden team is that they want to push the concept of climate change through every department. You know, when you talk to the people going to the Department of Commerce, they're thinking about climate. Mm-hmm. Agriculture, Tom Vilsack's going to be thinking about climate. And I think the goal will be to gradually coax the American economy into a greener economy. And that's okay. My personal view would be the fastest way to do that is you just put on a carbon tax and then everything sorts itself out. That, of course, is politically unfeasible. But I think this is a real emphasis by the Biden administration, and we should take it seriously. It's going to permeate everything they do.
You know, back to China just again, and that seems to be that China is dominating the questions as they scroll in front of me. You know, as you mentioned it, China has an aging population. And, you know, what result of the one-child policy for so many years, and seems to have created for themselves a pretty big demographic hole. What's the impact over that, over time of that?
Yeah, I'm so glad someone asked about that. It's a huge impact because, well, first of all, for the planet, actually having China have had a one-child policy for so long means that there are hundreds of millions of fewer Chinese than there otherwise would be. So if you're thinking in terms of just sustainability, that's probably not a negative thing. On the downside, you have a huge imbalance in young males and females, never a good sign for political stability. You probably have 45 million or so young Chinese men without a potential wife. That's a problem. And as you already said, it's a rapidly aging population. So by 2030, only 9 short years from now, more than half of Chinese will be not working. They'll either be children or retirees. That's really difficult. So all of the folks in my generation tend to have, you know, they're married, they have one child, but they have, you know, 2 sets of parents and 4 sets of grandparents that they're taking care of. So that's why you saw before COVID, even the Chinese economy starting to slow down. People are saving because they have to take care of mom and grandma. And eventually that's going to slow down the Chinese economy naturally.
Thank you. You know, changing direction a little bit here to more energy. Obviously, agriculture is heavily dependent on energy to run all of the machines that make modern agriculture work. The Biden team clearly has some designs on getting to a cleaner output of engines and so forth, Keystone Pipeline, all of that. Where do you expect that to go, and what impact do you think that's going to have over the next few years? How rapid is this change going to be?
Yeah, so let me just caveat this by saying I have no specific insight into what they're planning. I hope that we do it through incentives more than through sticks, right? You know, making sure that farm machinery is more efficient, having agreements on methane emissions like Hickenlooper and others put in place in Colorado. There was a broad-based coalition. They found a way to do it that was acceptable to farmers, but that made a huge difference in terms of methane emissions, which of course is a much more potent gas than CO2 emissions, so they're more important. So I think you're going to see a lot of little changes that hopefully will add up to a big boost in terms of what we can do for the climate.
Thank you. I got a question here, and it's a good question from my friend in West Virginia. You mentioned USMCA, and it certainly has had a lot of impact out there. Good agreement. Is that agreement in any jeopardy? Do you think that's going to stay for a while? What's your outlook on that?
Yeah, very good question. I think it's in no jeopardy at all. A lot of the pro-trade crowd was very worried when President Trump took on NAFTA and said, oh gosh, once you break it, you won't be able to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. But they did it, and they did a good job. And it went into force last year. I think there are a few little minor things still being ironed out. in terms of dispute resolution, how does it work exactly? But it appears to be working even in the midst of COVID. And I don't think we need to have a worry that President Biden will break it up again. It's new trade agreements that are going to be very difficult because, of course, he's got this coalition of labor and environmentalism. And so it's going to be, this is not a free trade president.
Right. Back to China again, and this is I'm trying to compile several questions that are along these lines. Several of our questioners noted that China is a pretty resource dependent country, and both for its food supply in many cases, as well as some minerals and other things that are so important to technology and future technology. How do you think that's impacting, or do you think that's impacting China's behavior? Some of which you mentioned. You see, you see the stronger reaction, flexing of some military muscle on one side. You see a lot of One Belt, One Road initiative on the other side. How does all this play out?
It's such a great question. It's such a well-informed audience. I wish I could be there in person, but that's exactly how it's playing out. So China has a lot of natural resources. What it's missing is enough oil and gas and enough water. Water is a huge issue because, of course, there's big desertification in the north of China. Rivers that used to run to the sea dry up before they reach the sea because so much water is taken out for agriculture. It's really dire. Not that they're going to import water, but you can see conflicts starting to emerge. So yes, part of what's happening with the Belt and Road Initiative is to ensure that China is not so dependent on a few choke points. It used to be the case until very recently that something like 85% of all the oil and gas coming into China went through the Malacca Strait, that very narrow strait right by Singapore. And, you know, if the US and allies wanted to, you could close that off, and that would mean the Chinese have to go all the way around. They're understandably worried about that. So that's why you see the big building projects in the Gwadar port in Pakistan, building rail lines through Pakistan to get access from Western China into Europe and into the Middle East. Understandable. But you can't account for all of China's increased assertiveness that way. A lot of it is also just pure nationalism.
Do you see? I guess, you know, we've seen the Arab Spring, and that largely has petered out. We've seen some dissident movements in China that have been cracked down on. Do you see any of those types of things gaining any traction? China seems to be, you know, this isn't a compliment, by the way, it's very good at containing that kind of thing. Do you think that's long-term viable for them?
Yeah, great question. Impossible to tell. Just like no one, even if they claim to after the fact, predicted the fall of the Soviet Union, authoritarian regimes like China are so opaque that no one knows if Xi Jinping falls until the day it happens. So the way I describe this to my Stanford students is authoritarian regimes are like a glass. They're really rigid. You can tap them 100 times and nothing happens, and tap them just the right way and they shatter. I do think that a Tiananmen Square type uprising is probably less likely in China because they have such Orwellian control over all of the media. You know, who has 2 million people monitoring the internet? That's pretty impressive and frightening, right? And now, you know, the last time I was in China, it's really extreme. Everywhere you go, there's facial recognition. The surveillance is constant. And so it is really Orwellian is the only way to describe it. And also genuinely popular because, you know, the Chinese have come out of COVID well, they are growing. There are a lot of things going well in the country. People are seeing their incomes rise. So if you do see a crack in the system, my guess, and it's only a guess, is that it's more likely to be the elite taking out Xi Jinping because they're not so happy that he's made himself president for life.
Well, let me give you one final one, and that is there's been a lot of discussion around a change in approach from the Biden team on trade. And obviously trade is so important to so many people on this, in this group. What do you see out there? It seems like every time the president speaks about trade, he talks about we, as opposed being the broader community, as opposed to just the U.S. How does that play out?
I think there's going to be a big internal debate about trade. So the friends I have who've gone into the foreign policy side tend to be more pro-free trade. For example, on China, if we could put the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, back together in some form, that would really help push back against some of the mercantilist actions you see out of China. However, you've got to do it in a way that protects American labor, that protects the environment. And so as you start negotiating these deals, I think they're going to be hard to do and fewer and far between.
That's terrific. Anja, thank you so much. We still have a long list of questions, but not any more time. We genuinely appreciate your insights here. It's a fascinating time. So many things going on out there, and audience, I really appreciate the great quality of questions. And I apologize we couldn't get to all of them. I tried to lump some of them together, so hopefully we got everything. We got all the topics covered anyway. So Anja, thank you again for being here. We really appreciate you spending some time with us. I think you've given us a lot to think about today. So thank you.
Thank you. Enjoyed being with all of you. Enjoy your day.